Hello and welcome to the Truth from the Stand Deer Hunting Podcast. I'm your host, Clint Campbell, and you're listening to episode number 74, brought to you by Wicked Tree Gear. Today, I'm joined by John Eberhart to talk hunting-pressured whitetails, out-of-state hunts, and saddle hunting. I'm also announcing the winner of the Exodus Trek giveaway, so stay tuned. All right. What is up, everyone? Happy Wednesday to all of you out there. Hope your week is going okay. Hopefully today's podcast will help you make it through the remainder of your week and with just a little bit more ease. I hope everyone's had a chance to get out and do some deer work. It's, of course, the season is fast approaching. I've been out doing a little bit of glassing, and actually last night I was pretty... So it's a little bit of both sides of this. So I was super stoked when I went out to glass last night. And I saw a hammer buck in a bean field. I've been kind of checking out this one area close to where I live, and there's some farmland. It's like kind of nearby, and been out glassing it a few times, and I've seen a few bucks. And I saw this one, just kind of caught a glimpse of him. I guess it was maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago, and I just hadn't had a chance to get back. And I finally had a chance to get out and do a little bit more glassing. And sure enough, he popped out the same place I had seen him the previous 3 weeks ago. The only bummer is, so I was super excited because he was beautiful mainframe 8, long brow tines, super long G2s. I mean, for Pennsylvania, he's a hammer. I don't want to say, venture a guess of what the score would be, but he'd probably be every bit as nice as the deer I killed 2 years ago in Ohio, possibly a little bit bigger. So it'd be, a damn nice deer to take for Pennsylvania. The only bummer is that he is near some public, but not nearly close enough that I just don't feel like he's going to venture that far away. He kind of lives, as I was looking at the map and kind of trying to figure out where I might be able to hunt him, he's basically encompassed in all private ground, of which I don't have any permission to hunt any of those areas. I'm hoping to change that. I've kind of pinpointed a few properties where I think he might be living, because essentially there's a bunch of ag that's around this, but most of the farms that are in this area, it's all fields. There's very little timber. So the field that I had glassed him in, there's a block of timber. I guess it would be to the west of that field, and then it kind of adjacent to that little block of timber is another property on the back side of that, so even further west, who has an even larger block of timber. And I'm talking small properties. I mean, this property that butts up to the field that I'm talking about is probably, when I looked at it, was, I think, a total of 10 acres, and there's probably 8 acres of timber. So I'm going to do my best to try to get access there, because this deer is just a hammer, and I have a feeling like all the other surrounding areas are just small strips of timber that's kind of in between homes and stuff like that. And so I have a feeling he's probably lived there for a while and not ever really been hunted. So he's probably, got to be a mature deer, and he's got all the bone to show for it. Which coincidentally, today we're talking with John Eberhart, and part of what we talk about a little bit is his approach to getting access to private ground. And I'm actually going to kind of put his words to use here. He has a philosophy of how he approaches doing it to let people know that he's serious. He's a dedicated hunter, that he's respectful, and that he's not just some dude that's going to come on the property and not pay attention to the way they want it hunted and the way they want things taken care of. So I'm going to take his words of wisdom, try to put them into action, and see if I can't get access to hunt this deer on one of the 2 properties that has the timber that's nearby where I'd seen him. So I guess stay tuned for that. We'll see how that kind of plays out. But before we get John on the line, we did have a Exodus Trek trail camera giveaway that we were running. So thanks to all of you who were participating in that. And we did do the drawing, or I did do the drawing for that. And the winner for this, drum roll, is Sean Pearson. Sean, you won the Exodus Trek trail camera. I will shoot you an email sometime this week. We'll get your contact information and get that thing mailed out to you so you can get it into the timber. So again, thanks to all of you who participated and entered. As I had mentioned, today's guest is none other than John Eberhart. I've read one of his books, Precision Whitetails, or Precision Bow Hunting, I believe is what it's called. And it's one of those things where, as if you read it early on in like your bow hunting life, it'll help you a ton in terms of how to kind of take bow hunting and take an all year round approach to it. For someone who's been bow hunting, I think what it did more for me than anything was it started kind of bringing things to light that I've been seeing, maybe overlooking. But in some instances, I'm reading his words, and then in this case, during this podcast, talking to him, and as he's saying things, it's like I'm remembering back to hunts that I've had, and kind of attaching those experiences that I've had with, the experiences in kind of, I guess, information and details he's laying out. And so it starts to all kind of come together. So for me, it's like I would recommend this book for anybody, beginner or someone who's been bow hunting for a while, just because it starts to really illuminate the things that you've been experiencing that you may just not have paid a lot of attention to or didn't necessarily know what the meaning of what you were seeing was. So super helpful. John's super nice guy. Appreciate him spending a bunch of time with me talking deer hunting, and we will get to that in 1 second. But before we do that, let's take a quick second to talk about our partners who continue to help us make this podcast possible. First and foremost, we are brought to you by Wicked Tree Gear, the longest lasting, fastest cutting, toughest tree trimming equipment you have ever used. Simply put, the toughest saws on earth. How tough are they? Tough enough to come with a lifetime warranty. And right now, you visit wickedtreegear.com, use the promo code TRUTH at checkout, and you get a 20% discount on your Wicked purchase. They've also just recently released the Pro Blade, which is the blade that is attachable to the pull saws that kind of keep it's a beast of a blade. It'll keep the branches that you're trimming at distance. It's kind of curved at both ends and allows you to kind of keep it on the blade, so you're not kind of jumping around all over the branch, and it makes it an easier time cutting at height. So go ahead and check them out at wickedtreegear.com. We're also brought to you by Exodus Outdoor Gear. The new Exodus Trek is a byproduct of all consumer voices who have been excited about what Exodus trail cameras have to offer, but just can't fit a $200 camera in their budget, and that's okay. A budget-friendly camera backed by the industry's leading warranty is now here. The Trek comes in at $145, and it has the same proprietary shell design as the Lift Series camera. Same 5-year warranty, awesome customer service, 0.7 second trigger speed, photo, video, time-lapse, and hybrid modes, all with a simple single-line backlit LED display. You also get about 20,000 images on one set of lithium batteries. If you'd like to learn more about Exodus trail cameras, check them out at exodusoutdoorgear.com. And if you like what you see, save yourself $20 and use the promo code TRUTH at checkout. We're also brought to you by Tecumani Seed. Everything's bigger in Texas. No matter if you are in the South, Midwest, or Northeast, Tecumani has your food plot seed needs covered. Visit Tecumani.com and check out their product selector tool and allow them to help you pick the right seed for your food plots. Use the promo code TRUTH at checkout and save 20%. They've also just recently released the Wicked Greens, which is an awesome for the Midwest and North for that fall and late season forage. So go ahead and check that out. I'm going to be putting that in here in like the next 2 weeks in 2 of my plots. We're also brought to you by Glacier Coolers, simply the world's finest. Whether you're hunting, camping, or fishing, you'll enjoy smarter design, stronger construction, and superior insulation of Glacier Coolers. Visit them at glaciercoolers.com, promo code TRUTH, save yourself 20%. And now without further ado, let's get Mr. Eberhart on the line. All right, folks, we are live, and welcome back to another episode of the Truth from the Stand Deer Hunting Podcast. So I have to say, I am pretty excited for today's podcast. I've been wanting to do this one for a while, but I made myself wait until I read this gentleman's book. So the gentleman that I have with me today is quite an accomplished hunter, but even more than that is he has several books that he's written. He's written for magazine articles. He has a web video thing that he's doing right now with deer and deer hunting, which is just chocked full of killer information. He has more record bucks on his wall than I've probably ever seen in my lifetime, doing it all on high pressure and permission access strictly. And I'm talking about no other than John Eberhart. How you doing, buddy?
Thank you, Clint. That was a nice intro. I'm doing very, very well. Thank you.
Good. Well, I aim to give great intros. If I don't do anything else well, I try to make at least the beginning really good. So we have at least that going for us. But I do appreciate you coming on. And as I had mentioned, I'd read your book, Precision Bow Hunting, here recently, and it kind of prompted me, made me think a lot about my approach. And I was just kind of thinking, if this is something that makes me kind of stop and take pause and take stock in how I'm approaching hunting overall, I thought it'd be great to kind of have you on and kind of talk through some of those scenarios. But before we dive into the meat of our conversation, if you wouldn't mind, and I know a lot of folks out there listening know quite a great deal about you, but just to kind of help level set the conversation, if you wouldn't mind, give us a little bit of background about who you are, what you do professionally, where you're from.
I'm a sales rep in the hunting industry. I live in Michigan, which is the most heavily bow hunted state in the country. You have about 320,000 bow hunters, and we're second on the gun hunting side to Texas. I do not gun hunt. I'm strictly a bow hunter. I started bow hunting in the mid-'60s. I currently have 50 bucks in the record book, 31 of Michigan. That's off 19 different properties, and I've taken 22 bow hunting trips out of Michigan to like Iowa, Kansas, Illinois, Ohio. And on those 22 bow hunting trips, I've taken 19 Pope and Young bucks off 13 different properties. So cumulatively, I have 50 bucks in the record book, and everything from day one has been on either public land, free walk-on properties, which you see a lot of that out west, or knock-on doors for free permission properties. None of my relatives own land. None of my relatives hunt, so I was self-taught. And I don't know. I've had opportunities to hunt and do some TV shows, which would be paid hunt ranches in lieu of free advertising, and I've chosen not to do that because I feel like I'd be letting down my followers because everything I do is on pressured land. I've written 3 books. The one you wrote or read, Precision Bow Hunting, was the middle one. I did a bow hunting pressured whitetails and then a bow hunting whitetails the Eberhart way. And I've written lots of articles for lots of magazines, national as well as regional, and do a lot of seminars in the Midwest at deer expos, Wisconsin, Ohio, Michigan, things like that.
Nice. Yeah. So I'm curious. You've been at this a long time, and you've had, as you kind of mentioned, a great deal of success. And as we know, you and I were talking right before we started hitting the record button that, I'm from Pennsylvania, which, I can kind of understand that the heavy pressure approach, especially when we're talking, public land. I mean, not for nothing, but even private land in Pennsylvania and Michigan hunts like public land in a lot of other states. Like I hunt Ohio public land, and it hunts probably better than most of the private land that I have access to in most regards. But I'm curious, just from a guy's perspective who's been doing this a long time. I've seen, a shift. It feels like that people are more and more interested in hunting public land, even though they know that it's more of a challenge, right? You got to put in more time. There's more work to be done. The odds are kind of stacked against you to a degree, unless you put your work in. And even then, it's not easy, right? So I'm just curious, what do you think is kind of driving that rejuvenation of the love of that challenge and hunting public lands and steering a little bit away from the private approach?
Well, I think it's twofold. First off, it's more gratifying to kill a 2.5-year-old buck on public land in a state like West Virginia, PA, Massachusetts, and Michigan, and New York. It's more difficult and more gratifying to kill a 2.5-year-old, let's say 95-inch, 14-inch wide 8-point, than it is to kill a 5.5-year-old in Iowa and Kansas and places like that. So it's more self-gratifying, and also more people are going to public land because, let's be real, the TV guys over the last 15 to 20 years have pushed this whole trophy agenda so much to the point where there's a lot of hunters that don't have access. You just can't go out and knock on somebody's door and get permission anymore. It's very, very difficult. So, everybody's leasing land and keeping everybody off and micromanaging it for big bucks. And, it's getting to be like Europe, where it's going to eventually end up being a rich man's sport, where if you got money, you can kill big bucks. And if you don't, you have to hunt, public land. It's unfortunately, it's going that way.
Right. Yeah. I 100% agree with you with the gratification piece. I shot a smaller deer last year. He's probably 2.5-year-old, 8-point, just almost described to a T, like you had just mentioned. And it was one of the more gratifying ones because it was a free permission, small parcel, about 3 acres, but it butted up against public. So I was kind of straddling the public-private line. And I put a little bit of time in there, and I hunted it the season before in late season, kind of thought I had an idea how it might get used. And sure enough, it panned out. And it was probably one of my favorite hunts, just because I had to kind of quickly put all the pieces together, and there wasn't like I had years and years of information to kind of base it off of. I didn't watch a deer grow up necessarily on that property to know that he was there.
You didn't have him named?
I didn't have him named, not that one. No, I didn't have him named. He was what we will call him is unlucky deer number. Unlucky.
Well, something else. Oh, well, I was just going to say something else that you said is very, very true. You get in states with high general populations like a PA, West Virginia, New York, Massachusetts, Michigan. When you have states with high general populations, you have very high property prices. So it's very common in, the rural areas in southern Michigan to have, 10 to 15 houses in a 640-acre section, and, they all own 5 to 10, 20 acres, maybe even 40. So even public lands in rural, states that have high general populations, it's not uncommon at all to have 20 to 30, 40 bow hunters in trees on opening day. They're not going to be 20 to 40 bow hunters every day of the season, but on opening day, that is the norm in lots of areas in heavily pressured states.
Yeah, no, 100% agree. And he was just unlucky northeastern Pennsylvania deer was what we'll call that guy. We'll call him
awesome.
We'll call him nice white European mount that I made sitting on my bar top. That might be a better, a more fitting name. But you had mentioned there as we were talking about the gratification of hunting public lands and what's kind of driving folks there, and and you started talking a little bit about private permission and how challenging it is that you just can't, it's, maybe 20, 30 years ago, you could walk up and knock on, Joe's door down the street and say, hey, can you mind if I hunt your property? And he may let you. Now it seems less and less likely, right? So, and I know you have a pretty great approach to, getting access. So, if you wouldn't mind, I want to just kind of uncover how you go about getting access. Cause I know you're a guy who likes to make sure he has plenty of options open to him.
Correct.
And so you're not just counting on having, I've got this property here and this property here and that's it. It's like you're anticipating you're going to lose properties year over. And so you kind of have a plan. So
absolutely. I know without question I've hunted at least 150 different properties in my lifetime, and I'm losing them and gaining them all the time. That's just part of the agenda if you don't have money to buy your own property. And basically what I typically do, now the last couple of years I haven't had to go out and get any new permission, although I did get permission to hunt one tree this year and I've already prepped it. But typically what I do is I put a resume together, just like you're putting a resume together for a job. My name, if I'm married, I put my kids, which I am married. I put my job, my phone number. I put my email address on it. All of my things that I'm into. I golf. I'm a member of this. I'm a member of that. And I make these resumes. And when I go online and I look at properties, and if I want to ask somebody for permission, I'll dress nicely. Nice and casual. I don't go up there in camel, and I don't go with a truck. I drive a minivan. I don't go up there with a truck with stickers all over it because that's offensive to a lot of people. And I'll ask for permission, and if they hesitate whatsoever, I stop them, and I give them that sheet of paper to let them know I'm a serious hunter. I hunt by myself, and I say, you know what? Do me a favor. Just take some time in the next week or so and read that, and let me get back with you in a couple of weeks. But I just want to let you know I'm serious. I'm going to take care of your property. I'm going to pick up after myself. I'll watch it for you. Keep an eye, let you know if anything's going on with other people sneaking in or whatever. And, and then I typically don't call them back. I try to go see them in person. Mm-hmm. That's what I typically do.
Nice. And so what do you think?
And that has worked pretty good.
That's so what do you think your success rate has been with that?
Depends on where I'm at. If I'm in Zone 3, which is the southern half of the southern peninsula in Michigan, my success rate is probably 10%. If I'm in Iowa, Kansas, Ohio, southern Ohio, my success rate, like in Kansas, is probably 60%. My success rate in Iowa and southern Ohio was probably 30 to 40%. Last year, I asked two property owners, and I got permission on both of them in southern Ohio. So it totally depends on where you're at. The more pressured the area, the more farmers are getting asked for permission. So obviously, the lower your percentages are going to be of getting free permission. Right.
So this kind of leads into my next question: that the idea of the more pressure, the more unlikely, right? Because they're probably getting peppered with requests to hunt their property. So That comes, being a sales guy, right? It's like you have to qualify the parcel. I like to call it. It's almost like qualifying a lead, to a degree. And so, when you're looking at a piece of land that you might want to hunt, how do you go about kind of qualifying it as something that you might want to hunt? And then, what's your scouting approach to define your hunting locations on those pieces that you're kind of starting anew and don't have, a historical kind of database to pull from?
Well, if it's public land, I have one standing rule. If I can walk to any location, if I go out and scout public land, I usually look at it on the internet in an aerial view first. But if I can walk in an upright position to any location from a parking area, I don't care how much sign is there, I won't set it up because I'm going to have company. Other people are going to find it. So
right.
On public land, I have to cross rivers with waders, a hip boots, a canoe, cross a lake, crawl through brush. I have to separate myself from the other hunters. Otherwise, there's no reason for me to expect any different results than what those hunters have. So I have to work harder than they do and go to places they are not willing to go. That's also the same places where the people that are hunting the easy access property push the mature bucks that I want to kill anyway. Mm-hmm. So that's where they're more likely back in the heavier cover to move during daylight hours. Mm-hmm. Now on private parcels, I will rarely even look at a private parcel unless I know, looking at an aerial, that it has a decent bedding area. Because on private parcels, if you don't have a bedding area and everything else is relatively open, the odds of a daytime opportunity in a mature buck that I want to kill is pretty unlikely. So there has to be a bedding area on the property or possibly bordering the fence line where they can come out of a bedding area into where I'm hunting. So that's my criteria. A lot of times I'll get permission and I'll scout properties and I never ever go back. Public lands or private. I've scouted lots of private parcels and the size is irrelevant. Mm-hmm. I've turned down 160 acre parcels in the past, whereas I've hunted hunted on 2 acre parcels and killed monster bucks on 2 acre parcels that were they were all bedding area.
Right. That's interesting. I've had that experience just this past year where there was a piece of public ground that I was looking at on an aerial, right? I was checking it out and it had piqued my interest. And it was one of those pieces where it wasn't huge and I felt like it might get overlooked. And so I did a walk through this past winter just to kind of see what was there, what sign was left there from the year before, and online it looked pretty good until I started hiking in. Now I did see some sign, and there was one kind of back corner of it that was really nasty thick that kind of fell down in this huge draw. But once I got there, what I realized was I couldn't see it on the aerial, but there was easy walking access pretty much all the way back to that spot. And so when I saw all the sign and stuff there, what that basically told me was that is most likely nighttime or nocturnal sign, most likely, because that is going to be a really easy access point. And then there were houses kind of down on the back side of that draw. It was a couple hundred yards away, but still it wasn't anything that was going to keep someone from kind of hiking in there, which, terrain-wise and habitat-wise, it looked pretty great. But just, walking in, I just had a feeling it was going to be overrun with people. So I backed out of that one, and that is now off the checklist, so to speak. But
all the sign in the world is irrelevant. There could be 10 scrapes and 50 buck rubs, and if it's easy access for other hunters and other hunters have permission on the same property, if that sign was made by a mature buck, odds are 99.9% it was made after dark.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, that's not to say it's not going to get visited by a year and a half and possibly even a 2.5. But 3.5-year-old and older bucks, very, very unlikely.
Right. Yeah. You're just wishing and hoping at that point. So
yes.
Yeah. So I'm curious. So we kind of get a glimpse into your approach whenever we're talking, public and private parcel, that when you don't have a whole lot of experience with it. But I want to get a sense, whenever you're making, so say you're going to go hunt, Ohio, right, for example, right, or any other out of state hunt for you, and that you don't have any historical information. Like, what is your approach for kind of taking that? Because it's always more challenging, right? Because I think some guys are intimidated by the fact that they can't just drive down the street and kind of check the parcel out. They really have to kind of do their mental preparation work before they get there, because they're going to have limited trips and limited time, in areas that they don't particularly live, which can be a little bit intimidating. So I'm just curious what your process is for that, that distance scouting and then seeing the parcel and kind of qualifying that from, from long range, so to speak, to set up for a hunting season?
I have never, ever, on any out-of-state hunt, went and scouted the property before I went there to physically hunt. So basically, if I get permission through a plat book, or now people can use Onyx or whatever, typically if I get permission, I'll look at an aerial and kind of get some idea of the lay of the land. Because typically when I go out of state, I'm going to an area that's lightly pressured.
Mm-hmm.
That if you're going to go out of state and spend a lot of money to hunt, you might as well go to an area where your odds are pretty good, where there's a lot of mature bucks.
Right.
So I just look for areas that might give me a hint of where to scout. But the first day and a half of a 7 to 10 day out-of-state hunt, and I always go out of state during Michigan's gun season because I don't gun hunt, but the first day and a half to 2 days, I don't even think of picking up my bow. My first day and a half to 2 days is 100% scouting and preparing locations. So I do a lot of speed scouting, and I usually go out there in mid-November. So the rut has typically been in swing for at least a week, the full rut, and pre-rut's been, gone and passed. So there's been a lot of buck activity. So there's going to be scrape areas, there's going to be fresh buck rubs, there's going to be a lot of sign. The runways are going to be well used, and when you go out there at that time, it's relatively easy to read the sign and find the pinch points, find the feeding destination locations. Let's say it's a white oak or there's a primary scrape area. And it's kind of weird because when I'm in Michigan, I would never ever do that. That would never work. You can't go in and scout the day before you're going to hunt and then expect to kill something, because your intrusion is probably going to make any mature buck avoid that area for a while. But out there, it doesn't seem to matter. Out there, I'll put cameras right on the locations that I prep, and I'll visit those cameras. I totally hunt cameras up when I leave out of state. I hunt according to what I see in the camera every day in the middle of the day when I check them. In Michigan, I don't even use cameras because they're intrusive and they're detrimental to my killing a mature buck in Michigan. That's how much difference the pressure makes as far as how the bucks react to human intrusions. Right. So all my scouting is done when I'm there, and I'll prep some trees, and then I may, because I hunt out of a saddle, I can react to visual changes. Let's say I prep something in 60 yards or 100 yards away, I'm visually seeing something because the foliage is going to be down. I've got a pretty big visual. I can see something, and I can pull my steps when I come down, and then, the next hunt, just walk over there, put steps up in a tree, find the right tree, and hunt. So I can freelance and alter my position really easily, much, much easier than somebody in a tree stand or a climber.
Right. So I definitely wanted to cover some saddle hunting. And since you kind of mentioned it, I figured, let's just go ahead and dovetail into that now, because I am getting ready to embark on my first season using a saddle, which I'm looking forward to, because I like hunting mobile. I like to hunt aggressive, to a degree. And more than anything, I hate carrying a bunch of weight. So it seemed like it was a good option for me. But I know you mentioned prepping your locations, and I know, reading some of your materials and watching you on some videos and stuff like that, you have a very specific approach to prepping a location to be prepared prior to the season, even by a point in time you want to be finished in, early spring, if I'm not mistaken. So if you wouldn't mind, just kind of walk me through your stand or your saddle location preparation.
Well, I do all my scouting in Michigan. I do all of my scouting and location preparation between February and the end of April, prior to spring green up, where I'm looking at last season's rut sign, because statistically, in every state in the country, and I've done the statistics, they're in every one of my books for every state, 55 to 65% of pulp and young bucks from every state are taken during the rut phases, which is a 3-week period. So if that high of a percentage of the bucks are being taken during that short of a period of the season, that's the time of season I want to key my hunting time around. So I go out postseason scouting. I look for old scrape areas, rub lines. I look for destination locations like isolated apple trees, abandoned apple trees in the woods, or white oaks, clusters of rubs, pinch points in transition security cover. And to prep a tree, basically, I'm putting in screw-in steps if I'm on private property. If somebody gave me permission, I'm putting in screw-in steps if I'm on public property. I just kind of mark the area where the tree is. I try to clean it up a little bit, but I use strap-on stuff there because you can't use screw ends.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll usually go into each season with, probably by the end of April, I'll probably have 40 trees prepped. I may only prep 5 to 10 new trees that spring, and then I go back and I clean up all my ones from the previous year. So I might have 40 trees prepped going into season, and then during mid-September, because Michigan season opens October 1, during mid-September I do what I term as a speed tour. So all the bucks that I want to kill, mature bucks, are almost always totally rubbed out by September 5th. So if I wait for September 15th to 20th and I go visit my early season locations like at White Oaks, isolated fruit trees, pinch points in transition security cover between bedding and feeding, I will go, and obviously if I've got a tree prepped where there's food and nothing's in, there's no acorns or no apples or no pears falling, or there's the crop rotations have changed and the deer aren't using this pinch point that I set up because last year they were going to corn and this year it's beans or something and they're not using it, they're going someplace else. I hunt accordingly. But my speed tour confirms if there's food, and it confirms if there's buck sign at that location, because that 2-week period from the time, 2 to 3 week period from the time they've rubbed out until I actually do my speed tour, there should be some kind of confirmed buck activity to warrant me hunting there if it is dropping food, or if it's working, the scrapes are active.
Okay, so so you're doing a ton of your work previously, and then you're kind of just kind of taking a real quick pass through to kind of confirm what you think is going to be happening before you kind of make your hard and fast decision. And it sounds like the saddle is what kind of allows you to do that, because it allows you to be super mobile, super agile, and kind of hunt where the most recent sign is being laid down. Right. Yeah.
If I have 40 trees prepped, keep in mind with a saddle, I've owned one saddle since 1981. I've exclusively hunted out of a saddle since 1981. I wouldn't even consider hunting out of a tree stand. I think they're extremely archaic. And the advantage of a harness over a tree stand is innumerable. I can list them if you'd like. But so I have my saddle with me in my pack. It weighs about 2 pounds, and I can go to any one of my trees and climb up it and hunt at any time. And I can shoot 360 degrees around the tree. I can use the tree as a blocker, move around the tree so the deer can't see me. Nobody can hunt it when I'm not there. Nobody can steal it. It's just got so many different advantages. And basically, if I'm going to go in on public land, I take my rope steps with me and just as I'm going up, because the saddle also has a safety belt.
Right.
So you can use it as as a safety climbing harness, so you have both hands free to put in steps as well.
So it's interesting because, after I started learning about it, I was pretty, naive or ignorant, it might be a better word, of saddle hunting overall until recently. And after I started reading about it and watching some videos, and I listened to some stuff that you've talked about in terms of saddle hunting, and talked to a couple other buddies who saddle hunt, and all the advantages are, as you had mentioned, are almost too many to list. So I'm curious, I feel like there's been a groundswell recently of more and more people being interested in the idea of saddle hunting.
Absolutely. No doubt about it.
Yeah. And it only makes sense as people want to be more mobile, and they understand, like, you don't want to burn stands out, and you got to kind of be able to move where the sign is and stuff like that. But I'm curious, I want to get your opinion. Like, why do you think it has taken people this long to start to really, in a meaningful way, start to adopt this approach, right? Because it's been around, to your point, for a long time, right? But now it just seems like recently it's become more in vogue, so to speak. And I'm just curious if you have a thought on why you think all of a sudden it
I know exactly why. When they first came out, the tree sling in the early 80s, 1981 I think is the first year. It's just a bunch of seatbelt fabric, it's just a bunch of fabric in a package. And obviously if you go in an archery shop and there's one hanging on the wall, odds are really, really high that there isn't anybody in the archery store or whatever sporting goods store you're in that knows anything about it. Right. So they can't talk intelligently about it and explain it. So they say, yeah, you don't want that. You want to use this tree stand. Because nobody that works in a sporting goods store wants to look like an idiot. So they sell around it. And also Trophy Line, when they came out with their saddle commercially, I think it was in the mid-90s, if I would have bought a Trophy Line saddle and I endorsed them because it was the same type of system I was using. But if I'd have bought one and used it the way they showed in their instructional DVD, I would have never, ever hunted out of it. Most people that did try them, because they were popular there for a while in the late 90s, they tried them according to the instructions on the DVD, and they're very, very uncomfortable. You have to know, and I'll be more than happy to give you my email address, and anybody that wants all the pertinent information on advantages, how to hook up, how to set up a tree, I'll be more than happy to send it. I've got it in a regular document that I just click on and send. But now there's an actual website called saddlehunter.com. And there's a lot of guys that are harness hunting. They're getting new members daily. And there's a new one coming out on the marketplace called the Mantis, like the praying mantis. Mm-hmm. And it's made by a company named Tethered, and it's awesome. It only weighs 15 ounces. Mm-hmm. And when you learn, and it's not that difficult if you have some instruction on how to tether to the tree, how to hang comfortably, you'll never, ever look at a tree stand again. But if you don't learn properly, it's going to be uncomfortable.
Right.
And, when I first bought mine, nobody knew about it. I just bought it because it looked different. And I took it home, I sat in it, and I was extremely uncomfortable. But I looked at this thing, and I said, my God, if I can figure out how to make this thing work, it has so many advantages over tree stands. This will up my kill percentages and where I can hunt, because trees become unlimited. Big trees, small trees, angled trees. I just knew if I figured out how to do this. So I made a lot of alterations so that it worked for me, and I've never, ever looked back. And again, I'd be more than happy to send emails to anybody that send me an email for saddle information.
Yeah, and I will attest to that document. I actually I read it this morning on my train ride to work, oddly enough.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and read through it, and it has everything you could possibly need to know about setting up a saddle. And I'm glad you mentioned the guys from Tethered. I actually had Greg Godfrey on here just a couple weeks ago, and he was the one who kind of introduced me to the idea of a saddle to a degree, and I talked to him at length about how to get started and stuff like that. So I will have one here shortly, and I'll be swinging in my backyard, and I might be sending you an email saying, "Hey, I ended up upside down. How do I keep from doing that?"
That can't happen. You cannot fall out of a saddle. That's physically impossible. Right. So, nobody has ever fell out of a saddle.
Well,
ever.
You may not have. We just met, so just hold on. I'm just kidding. So I'm curious. I know you do a lot of prep, and you go and you clean up your trees and you clean up your area because you're really reducing your impact overall. I know that's kind of your approach, where you want to be scent free, and we can talk about the scent stuff here in a little bit. And you want to be scent free, sound free. You do your prep in advance. I'm curious though. As far as clearing cover, right? So when you're cleaning up a tree and stuff like that, like, I guess I just want to know your approach on kind of cutting shooting lanes in, because certain guys like to have limited lanes, certain guys like to really clear out wide swaths of lanes. I feel like I typically like to I prefer to have cover versus shooting lanes. Like I'll miss an opportunity versus blowing up my spot, getting busted possibly. But that was in a stand. I feel like I'm teetering now a little bit more now that I'm entertaining the idea of saddle hunting, because I can now start to use the tree as my cover and position myself in a way to where I'm not going to get busted. So I'm just curious what your approach is on clearing out lanes.
Before we continue our conversation, let's talk about Wicked Tree Gear saws. Hardcore deer hunters need hardcore tools. Do yourself a favor and check out Wicked Tree Gear, the toughest hand saws and pull saws on earth. You buy it once, you buy it for life, backed by a lifetime guarantee. Right now, if you use the promo code TRUTH, you'll save 20% on your next purchase with free ground shipping. So head over to wickedtreegear.com and get a saw that's tough enough to work as hard as you hunt.
I never hunt a place in Michigan. I never hunt a single location more than 3 times a year. The element of surprise is a big, big deal. So I make very wide shooting lanes. And when I get a shooting lane finished on private land, obviously on public land, you're not supposed to cut anything. I'm not saying I don't, but I'm a little more minimalist on public land than I am on private.
Right.
But on private land, I clear probably 6 to 8 foot wide shooting lanes, and they are clear. There isn't a twig or a weed that could encumber a shot to a runway in that given shooting lane. And, like if let's say I'm at a white oak tree. Let's say I'm at a tree where I have a shot to a white oak. Now that's a destination spot. So that's or let's say an apple tree out in the woods, an abandoned, isolated apple tree. They're coming to that specific spot. So I may I'd only have a shooting lane to that location. I'm not going to have a wheel spokes like, I would in a bedding area where I'm going to have maybe 5 different shooting lanes going in different directions. I'm just going to have a shooting lane to that destination spot or at a scrape area. So, the location you're hunting should dictate how many shooting lanes you have, and how high up the tree also should dictate how wide they are. What time of season you're hunting them should dictate how wide they are. If it's an early season location where you're going to have a lot of foliage, you're going to have to make them pretty wide so you get a shot, because you're not going to see the deer coming a lot of times, and they pass through those lanes pretty quick. Right. And you're going to have cover in the tree, so it's not going to matter. And with the saddle, you'll typically end up hunting higher, because once you get comfortable with it, you definitely will hunt higher than you will on a tree stand. Right. And with the saddle, you can use the tree as a blocker and move around the tree on an as-need basis, so the deer, non-targeted deer can't see, or even if it's a deer you want to, you just peek around the tree and look at him, and then when he turns his head in a different direction or whatever, you just spin slightly to the side of the tree and make your shot.
Right. And so, to your earlier points, the element of surprise is key, right? It's like cut the shooting lane for the application of the spot, in the time of year, as you had mentioned, but the element of surprise is really your ace in the hole to a degree.
Yeah. And you're in PA, so you know this as well as anybody. Your second opportunity at a buck at a location in PA or Michigan is pretty close to zero.
Right.
So if you don't make that opportunity work and make that location work on the merits you chose that for, and make adequate shooting lanes, and you miss that opportunity, you probably won't get it again.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, 100%. I've experienced that. Unfortunately, I've experienced that pain. So yeah, but it's giving me flashbacks. So we're going to go ahead and move on from that. But so I want to do a hard transition here, and I want to kind of shift gears and talk now a little bit about sign, right? Because there was a part of your book the entire book is a great read, and I encourage anyone who's diehard into bow hunting to pick up any number of them. But this one, particularly the precision bow hunting, there was a section in it that I really, really enjoyed, and I thought had some really, really great information. And you really start talking about the hierarchy of sign, because I think folks get enamored with different types of sign, different times in your unit. It doesn't always match up to when that sign is most relevant, right? And I thought you laid out in a really nice, succinct way the priority that you kind of give each piece of sign that you're going to kind of encounter in the timber, and when and how you should hunt it. So if you wouldn't mind, I kind of want to go through each of them and just kind of get you to talk a little bit about them. And the first one is that you kind of talk about, and everyone will talk about primary scrapes, right? Like you hear people talk about primary scrape areas. But as I was kind of reading your book, and I realized, what a lot of people are referring to as primary scrapes aren't necessarily that, right? And so I started thinking about my own experiences and where I've seen primary scrapes as you kind of explained them versus what I had seen that I thought might have been a primary scrape that wasn't. And I quickly realized where those locations were and weren't. Based on prior experience. So if you wouldn't mind, give us the details of how you kind of define a primary scrape area, what it kind of includes, and how you might go about setting up to hunt it, and what time of year you might hunt it. Okay,
primary scrape areas, first off, they are always 100% of the time made where there is good doe activity. To a buck, everything revolves around food, sex, and security. So obviously, if you're at an apple tree, or if you're in a tight pinch point, or you're at a white oak tree, or you're at a corner of a crop field or something where deer have to skirt around the corner on the inside corner, any place where there's heavy doe activity, that's the likely places you're going to find primary scrape areas. Typically, if you find an apple tree out in the woods and it's got apples, odds are really, really high, it's going to end up being a primary scrape area. Bucks are going to visit it. So primary scrape areas are my number one thing that I look for, and I typically save those. I might hunt them if they're active when I do my speed tour, if there's an apple tree dropping apples or white oak dropping acorns and there's not a lot of other oaks in the area, typically if they're dropping, there will usually be a scrape or two. And those are spots that, now I've got confirmed food, and obviously there's does there. That's why the scrapes are there. And I've got confirmed buck activity. So that's a spot I'll put in my early season, first 2 or 3 days of bow hunting rotation. And then other than that, primary scrape areas I typically save until pre-rut, which, around October 25th. So once I hunt them the first day or 2 or 3 of the season, I'll leave them alone until at least October 25th, depending on the weather. The second thing I look for would be the mast and fruit trees, that are isolated. They have to have perimeter security cover, and they have to have transition security cover from a known bedding area. That's one thing a lot of people don't get. If you're hunting in a pressured area, everything revolves around security cover. If I went and scouted and I found a primary scrape area and it was right on the edge of a crop field, and that crop field, let's say I set up a location there because I don't know what the crop's going to be the next year. If that crop field was going to be hay or soybeans or anything that was short, I would not hunt that spot that fall. Mm-hmm. No way. Because a mature buck is not going to come out into an exposed area next to an exposed field and work a scrape in the daytime. Now, if that crop was standing corn, then he's got immediate security cover butting up to the timber wherever the scrapes are. So he's got security cover to security cover. And let's say I find a scrape area and it's at a white oak tree, and there's some open timber between that white oak tree and the bedding area that he'd be coming in, let's say for an evening hunt. That location is going to be pretty much worthless because a mature buck that I want to kill is not going to come through that open timber with no understudy and be exposed to come to that scrape area during daylight hours. That's going to be an after dark scrape area for him. So you have to not only look at a scrape area or an apple tree or whatever, you have to look at the security cover around it, and it needs to have transition security cover to a known bedding area. They're not going to walk through an open area to come to a destination location. Now, if it's next to a cornfield, the cornfield is a bedding area.
Right.
As long as it's standing, a deer could easily, bucks bed in standing corn. They could easily step out of the standing cornfield and walk 5 or 10 yards and work a scrape and have immediate exit security cover if needed. So security cover is a big issue. And bedding areas would be my number 3 option. I love hunting the interiors of bedding areas. If none of my mast or fruit tree or scrape area locations are active, early season when I do my speed tours, I'll hunt on the interiors of bedding areas. And then during the rut phases, it's very common for me to hunt interiors of bedding areas. If I wanted to kill you or anybody listening to us talk, obviously my most opportune place to hide would be in their closet in their bedroom. Right. Because they're going to come in there and bed every day. Bedding areas are destination locations. Some of them are different size than others. But if you go in there and do your postseason scouting, in February, March, April, you can spook every deer out of there for 3 or 4 days in a row. You can go in there and molest the heck out of that spot and prep a couple bedding area locations and then totally leave them alone until, November 1st. When the rut phase, pre-rut, or whatever rut phases start, and then you got to commit to an all-day hunt. If you're going to hunt in a bedding area, you can't hunt mornings or evenings alone, because if you hunt mornings, you're going to spook them with your exit. If you hunt evenings, you're going to spook deer in the bedding area with your entry. Right. So you have to commit to saving it for the rut phases, and you have to commit to being on stand an hour and a half before daylight, and you can't leave until at least a half an hour after dark. So you got to be there before the deer come in the morning, and you got to be there. Don't leave until after all the deer have gotten up and left the bedding area in the evening, so you're not spooking anything with your entry and exit. Those are my 3 preferences. Okay,
so I have a question about scrapes. So I just want to get your perspective on this. I was talking to a buddy of mine. He hunts all public land. He's got a pretty prominent YouTube channel, younger fella. And we were talking about scrapes and hunting scrapes. And one thing that he's kind of found, and I'm just curious what your thoughts are on this, is that what he noticed is that he's seeing scrapes that are kind of happening earlier in the season, right? And then what he's then finding is that pressure hits, right? Because that pre-rut time kind of hits, and everyone's like, oh, I'm going to hunt over scrapes, and then all of a sudden those scrapes dry up, right? And so then guys say, well, they're not working scrapes anymore, But what he's found is like going that level, almost like whenever you walk into the timber, you have to go a level beyond where everyone else is going to walk on public land, because you want to be inside that circle where they're going to push deer into where you're going, right? He's finding a similar thing happening with scrapes, where it's like the scrapes on the outside of that circle are starting to dry up. And he said he's found just magic happen on that secondary. And what we were kind of referring to them were like, secondary scrape lines that are really now the primaries, because you've now pushed them off of their normal area where they were comfortable prior to pre-rut. Now, have you ever seen anything like that, or do you think that's a possibility, or do you, is that a rational way of kind of thinking about that? I'm just curious what your thoughts are.
That's somewhat rational, because something else a lot of hunters don't understand is, you have the early season where you got a lot of foliage, and if there's food, there's going to be scrapes if there's a lot of doe activity at that spot. But then you go into what I term, and a lot of people term, the October lull, and during the October lull, deer not only change their habits and routine, and mature bucks turn more nocturnal, not only because of hunting pressure. I mean, hunting pressure is a big part of it, but also there's a security cover change.
Mm-hmm.
The foliage is dropping, the weeds are tipping over. So, by October 5th, everything's green. By typically October 25th to the end of October, all the leaves have fell, and the whole visual security cover to a deer during that time frame has changed. So they change where they're moving, according to security. They go to places where there's a better security cover to transition through. So that could make a reason for the change in the scrape areas. And it also could be because the crops, if scrape areas were put in a specific location due to a preferred crop field, and then that gets picked and turned over by the farmer, well, that's not a preferred crop field anymore. So whatever doe activity that was transitioning to that crop field is not transitioning there anymore. So that's why that particular scrape area that was in conjunction with that crop is no longer being worked. Or if it's in conjunction with acorns or apples, the apples have dropped now and they're all gone. So obviously those scrapes are going to become inactive because there's no doe activity there. Or same deal with with the acorns. If there's not a lot of oaks in an area and the turkeys and the deer consume them all, well, then those scrapes are going to dry up because now there's no doe activity. All scrape activity revolves around doe activity, and it's also very common in big public land areas where it's almost all timber. You don't see a lot of scrapes. In big timber areas, deer tend to wander, because they don't have crop fields, and they browse on, leaves and grasses and stuff like that. So it's very hard to pattern anything in big timber areas, and scrape areas are very uncommon. You go out west where, it's 60 to 70% ag and 30% timber. Man, oh man! I mean, there's scrapes every place.
Right.
It's ag areas are scrape areas are much more prevalent in ag areas than in big timber.
Right. So I want to talk a little bit about staging, right? Because one of the things that I know that you kind of talk about a little bit is field edge staging versus rut staging areas, because I never really had thought about this before, and I'll preface it a little bit and ask you to kind of further explain it and make more sense of it than me. But the rut staging areas really kind of had me intrigued, because what you were kind of talking about a little bit was, that a buck's going to try to find a doe, right? Whenever you hit a certain time of year, and you're looking to not necessarily intercept him whenever he's hitting a food source or what have you. What you're looking for is that he's going to have to bed down somewhere near a travel corridor that he anticipates or knows that does will pass through, right?
Yeah.
And so so just talk to me a little bit about that, because I found that pretty fascinating, because I never thought of that kind of approach to rut staging areas. I've always kind of thought of food staging areas, and I think that's the most common way people think about it, right? Like, what's the place deer are going to go to kind of meander until it gets 10 minutes before dark and they hit a food source or whatever. But the rut staging thing was a really interesting concept that I really liked.
Well, the rut staging deal versus the food staging, most writers, and you see it on TV all the time, I think almost 99.9% of TV hunters don't know squat. I mean, I hate to be that blunt. I don't care who it is. I think hunting in Kansas and Iowa, the areas they hunt, most people could kill the same deer they're killing. And why people do what they do and assume it's going to work in a pressured area blows my mind, actually.
Yeah.
But a field edge staging area, I've totally abandoned those. I don't even deal with field edge staging areas anymore, because a big buck, a mature buck in a pressured area, is not going to get up and move and make himself vulnerable in the evening to go stage next to a crop field waiting for does to come through. So those field edge staging areas, and I did write a chapter on those in my first book, Boning Pressured Whitetails, in 2002 I wrote it. But I've totally abandoned that because they just don't work in pressured areas as far as warranting the percentage of opportunities versus the time spent hunting on stand at those. But a rut phase staging area is basically could be along the edge of a bedding area. Let's say they're bedding on just on the inside edge of a bedding area, or let's say they're bedding in a funnel of transition cover between a crop field and a bedding area. And, they're just bedding in spots where, and they don't do this until typically pre-rut or rut. They don't do this anytime prior to that. But they'll stage there in the morning. They'll come out of the field well before daylight, stage in these transition zones, and then as the deer transition through there, they'll either stage on the downwind side of the transition zone so they can just check them while they're bedded, or they'll actually get up and go over and check does as they come through. So that's the difference between a rut phase staging area. It's typically going to be in some semblance of cover. Again, everything is security cover and perimeter security cover for the kill zone. Everything is based on that. Whereas a feeding staging area is, and you see it, feeding staging areas happen out west all the time because there's so many mature bucks and there's just no hunting pressure. And a mature buck has no issue getting up at, let's say, 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon and moving through the timber and staging next to a exposed crop field where does are going to come and move through, late in the evening to go out and feed. Right. But you just don't see that in pressured areas.
Right. Yeah. No, I 100% agreed. So I'm curious. You were talking a little bit about those the big woods is just different, right? When it comes to deer movement and so forth. Do you have any kind of approaches or a way to define staging areas when you get into the big woods? I mean, I know it's a lot looser as far as what you're going to look for in terms of sign or anything like that is just not going to be nearly as concentrated. But do you have any kind of rules of thumb to locate staging areas in the big woods?
I always gravitate to security cover, and typically in big woods, you're going to have terrain feature, what I call terrain feature dumps. You may have an oak ridge, it dumps down into a swamp, and maybe it's got a saddle running along the bottom side of it. Deer tend to travel through saddles because saddles are lower ground. They have more moisture in the ground. Therefore, there's more vegetation in the ground, so there's more security cover in the form of brush and weeds and stuff like that. So deer tend to travel through saddles a lot because they're low spots. Whereas when you get up into the timber up on the hills, it's more open, so they're more vulnerable during daylight hours. So when I'm in big timber, I always, even when I go out west, even though out west I've watched 150-inch 8-points walk across a grass field an inch and a half tall in the middle of the day, I still, even when I go out there, I gravitate everything towards, I want perimeter security cover around the kill zone where I'm actually located, and I want transition security cover to a known bedding area. As long as you hunt security cover, and I'm not talking about being in the middle of a big, brushy, thick,
right,
bunch of crap. I'm just talking about having some semblance of security cover that a mature buck can feel comfortable walking through or along, where he has got instant 2-second exit route option. And as long as a person always gravitates everything around some semblance of perimeter security cover at the kill zone and transition security cover to a bedding area, he's going to do very, very well.
Right. So
I don't know if I answered your question exactly.
No, you did. I mean, I think the takeaway really for the big woods is that it's tough. You know what I mean?
Big woods is very difficult.
Yeah.
I exclusively hunted big woods for 20 years in northern Michigan, and very, very difficult. And that's why because again, there's very, very few, if any, destination locations. Deer tend to browse and wander. A deer in northern Michigan might have a 3 to 5 mile core area. A deer in southern Michigan, where there's a lot of ag and a lot of does, he might have a 1 mile core area. I'm not saying it's in 1 square mile, but 640 acres combined of all the areas that he's moving through. And when I go out of state, that's one thing I definitely gravitate to. I always, when I'm looking at aerials, I'm looking for properties that are 60 to 80% ag, because when I go, all the crops are down, and all the deer are confined in 20% of the land. Right. And it's much, 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 much simpler because everything's bedded in 20% of the property now.
Yeah, I was looking for a challenge this year, so I went with my buddy to a big woods piece of public in southern Ohio last year, and that was, the terrain was tough just in general, and it was all previously clear cut and stuff like that. And there was some great deer there to be had. Age structure was awesome. I didn't get shut out. I saw 3 bucks, just nothing I was wanting to pull my bow back on. But man, that was just you just felt like some days you were going crazy. You know what I mean? Because you were like, everything's telling me there should be deer here. You know what I mean? And you just weren't seeing anything. So it was definitely it was a learning experience. It was a humbling experience, which I think, in hunting is always good to have those. Sometimes it knocks you back a peg or two and lets you know you have plenty to learn yet. But so
on a short-term hunt, big timber is not your friend.
Yeah, it was
for sure.
Yeah, it was a long 8 days, shall we say? So few deer, but nothing to write home about. So I want to talk a little bit about scrape lines, because I know that this kind of falls very low, I think, at the bottom of your hierarchy of sign that you like to approach. And what you had talked about a little bit, or what I kind of thought was really interesting, was everyone always kind of tries to figure out how to dissect scrape lines and rubs, and is it a mature buck? Is it not a mature buck? Is it a subordinate buck? What type of buck is making this rub? And you hear all types of takes on it. But what I read from you really made a lot of sense. And then fortuitously, you just recently released, or Deer and Deer Hunting just recently released a video of you kind of talking about this exact subject. So if you wouldn't mind kind of, walk us through, whenever you're looking at rubs, like what you're looking for, what are they telling you, and then how are you kind of deciphering that information?
Okay. Well, first off, when I'm scouting and during season in Michigan, I said I don't use cameras, so I have no clue what's on the property. I never have an idea in Michigan what's on the property. I totally hunt sign. So I look at buck rubs as I look at the height that they are. Typically, if you're a year and a half old or 2.5-year-old buck, you've got short. The antlers aren't real high off your head. The tines are kind of short. You're not that tall. They're not that tall. So the rubs are going to be kind of down low. They're going to be maybe 3 foot off the ground and to 2 foot off the ground. As bucks age, they get taller. Their necks get longer. Their antlers get higher off their head, and their tines are longer. So the rubs are going to be 3 to 4, maybe even they have tine grooves 5.5 feet up the tree. So the height of the rub has a lot to do with the age of the rub. The higher the rubs, the older the deer. As far as scrape lines, that's basically a buck's route. That's a specific buck's routine route where he's going from point A to point B. And I definitely will hunt if I see a scrape line and it's like pre-rut, late October, early November, or if I even see a scrape line, if I see one before season in my speed tours, I know it's a mature buck, because subordinate bucks, year and a half old bucks, don't make scrapes very, very rarely prior to getting into the season. They just don't make scrapes in September. So I know it's going to be at least a 2 and possibly a 3.5-year-old buck. And typically, if you see a scrape line, there's going to be rubs along it as well. So the rubs along the scrape line are going to kind of give you an idea of how old he is by how tall the rubs are. But active scrape lines are definitely a good place to hunt. When you're postseason scouting, if you see a scrape line, I don't know if that buck got killed or not. Right. Whereas if I see a primary scrape area, those are usually annual. Those are all the bucks in the area typically visit scrape areas, whereas a scrape line is typically one deer's scrapes along his route.
Right.
So, but if I see an active scrape line during season, absolutely, I'll freelance in and I'll set up on it. And I've killed, my biggest buck I ever shot was freelance hunting. Just steps on my in a fanny pack and walking through the woods and setting up on sign, a 180 incher.
That's a nice freelance job right there. It's not.
Yes, that was, and I've killed several bucks just freelance, just putting my stuff on and walking into the timber and hunting.
Nice.
All evenings, obviously.
Right. So what about rub lines? Like, is there anything you take from a rub line? Is there any information that tells you about a deer? Is there, because I know sometimes it can be helpful, sometimes not. Like, you're not quite sure what size of deer was it made that or how mature it was, in terms of the rubs. Is there anything you take from that?
Exactly the same as a scrape line. If I'm out postseason scouting and I see a rub line, it's totally irrelevant to me. Mm-hmm. If I see a rub line during, pre-rut or maybe just prior to season, and it's tall rubs and they're obviously that year's rubs, yeah, there's a very good chance I might, set up on it and hunt it one evening or one morning, depending on the location. But it has to have security cover.
Right.
It has to have security cover along. If it doesn't have security cover to transition down, no, I will. You see the TV guys hunting rub lines and scrape lines on TV in open timber. You watch Michael Waddell walking through the woods with a climber on his back and jumping in a tree in open timber and killing a big buck. That doesn't happen in real hunting. That just does not happen that way. So they do things that the normal hunter can't do. It's kind of like sports.
Right.
LeBron James, Michael Jordan, Tiger Woods, those guys rise to the top of their sport because they competed in middle school, high school, college, and then even in the pros, and they outperformed all of their competitors on the same types of, field or court or golf course or whatever.
Right.
In hunting, the TV guys don't compete with anybody.
Right.
They are not professionals. They're entertainers.
Right.
And there's nothing like sports people that actually had to compete with tens of thousands of people in the same fields and to get to the top of their sport. In hunting, those guys hunt properties that nobody else can hunt. They have zero competition.
Right. I mean, that's an interesting way to look at it, entertainment versus hunting to a degree. You know what I mean? Like, that's,
yeah.
I never really kind of thought it in that way, but that's kind of exactly what they're doing. It's entertainment, and I'm sure, for some folks it has its place, but I mean, for a person, like, that's not a good kind of judge or barometer to set your goals against, right? Because you can't set your goals against them. I guess the thing that I struggle with is people that are hunting in PA and Virginia and Michigan to watch those shows and then try to mimic what those guys are doing and expect it to work in the areas you're hunting. Mm-hmm. That just doesn't work. If you're a bass fisherman and you could take a novice bass fisherman that could just barely cast and retrieve a line, and you could put him on a farm pond that never gets fished, and he'll catch lots of bass. Right. You take that same fisherman and you put him on a public lake where they hold local tournaments now and then, and it gets fished every day. He probably wouldn't catch a legal bass in an entire day because he doesn't know how to do it. Right. Yeah. I would be the latter of bass fishermen. My fishing skills are not good. I will stick to hunting out of a tree. I'm more equipped to do that. That's for sure. The one thing I found interesting when you were talking about rubs, I think I read it in the book. I think it's where I kind of come across it was, I've always struggled with understanding how to read a rub and know, like, and I know you kind of talked a little bit about time length and stuff like that and how high it is on the tree. But the thing that I really kind of took away was, when a tree is shredded, right? Like, there's this more mature bucks typically, or tend to, I won't say typically, might be the wrong way to say it, but tend to have this purling that's at their bases, right? And that is really kind of like when you see something that's shredded, not 100% because nothing's 100% certain, but you can probably with pretty good certainty say that is an older deer for that property if the tree is kind of looking like shredded wheat, because a deer would need some purling on their bases to be able to pull that off, right?
It would still have to be higher up the tree.
Okay, still higher up the tree.
It's still, the height has to be there. But yeah, as bucks age, it is more common for an older buck to have purling and abnormal points, maybe forked brow tines or some other little kicker points, and scrape the tree up a little bit more. But still, that rub would be higher up the tree. And also another indicator of rubs is if you got your main rub, let's say it's 3 to 4 feet high, which is pretty high, and then 8 to 10 inches above the actual main rub, you've got little tick marks in the bark. That means that buck's got long tines too, because the tips of those tines are biting into the tree and making little tick marks in the tree too. So that's another indicator.
Right. So one thing, I hear you talk about hunting weather, right? I've heard you talk about that, videos, books, what have you. So I'm just curious, what's your approach to hunting weather? What weather do you like to hunt? What do you like to avoid? What are days that you won't go out and get into your saddle?
There's no day that I won't go out and get into my saddle. If I've got the time off work and it's the right time of season, I'm going to go. But probably my favorite hunting weather would be a drizzle rain with a light breeze. I like to have mature bucks like to move where they're not making noise. If there's one thing I've learned about mature bucks in a pressured area especially, when they move in the evening, if it's dry out and it's nice sunny bluebird day, they'll take a step and they'll stand there for 20 seconds and listen for a reaction. They just hate making noise. So on a drizzly day, they're much more apt to move with a purpose and move more quickly. So they're covering more area, which obviously raises a hunter's opportunities because they're covering more area during the daylight hours. And wind is the same way. Wind masks their movement noise just like rain does. I don't like hunting in a heavy rain, but any light precipitation, whether it be rain or snow, those are my preference. And then during the full moon phase, if the full moon is out at night with no cloud cover, I really like to key on hunting midday the next day. This is during the rut phases, by the way, not early season. During the rut phases, I key on the midday the next day if the full moon is out that night with no cloud cover, because the mature bucks don't like moving in a full moon after dark that much out in exposed areas, so they move a lot more the next day in the middle of the day.
Right. So yeah, I'm glad you kind of brought up the moon, because I was going to ask you if the moon, kind of the red moon, etc., underfoot, overhead, if that's something you subscribe to, or do you not pay much attention to it, or does weather kind of dictate your approach to a degree? I know you hunt any day you have the ability to go hunt, but if you could kind of pick which things are most important to you to kind of say, I'm going to go hunt my best spot today, what would that be dictated by, moon or more so weather?
Moon, other than a full moon with no cloud cover, me hunting in the middle of the day and the next day, moon phases have absolutely zero to do with my hunting decisions. I used to do a lot of shining back in the late 60s and maybe into the mid 70s. The shining used to be a big deal. Everybody used to do it. And it was very interesting because I took notes. I always take mental notes of everything and write a lot of stuff down. When there was a full moon out, right, as soon as it got dark, if the moon was up high and, it was up for another 3 or 4 hours, you wouldn't see hardly any 2.5-year-old bucks. Back then, you hardly ever saw a 3.5-year-old because we had 1 million hunters, gun hunters, and they killed everything. There wasn't any management whatsoever. But you'd hardly ever see a decent buck. Now, if you took, and it was a full moon, but yet it was cloud cover or light drizzle rain, so it was gray out, so it was basically dark because the moon was totally covered, you'd see a lot of decent bucks. So the moon phase had absolutely nothing to do with it. It was the weather revolving around the moon phase.
Interesting. Yeah, I used to like going shining when I was a kid. That was even in like the late 80s and early 90s. I still enjoy doing that. I might need to bust out the old spotlight here one evening and take a cruise down memory lane just for old time's sake. You know what I mean?
I don't think I've went shining since the early 80s.
Well, if I happen to go, I'll shoot you an email and let you know how it went. Let you know how much fun it was. I know we've been talking for about an hour, and there's a pile of things we could jump into, and I feel like we probably need to have like a follow-up podcast with you and talk more about like your scent regimen, because I know that's something that you take seriously and stuff like that. But before I
pay
do
zero attention to the wind.
right, yeah, I know. It's so I mean, if you're game for it, do you mind diving into some of the scent control and wind stuff
On another podcast or right now?
Either or, whichever works for you.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm game. I've got time.
Cool. All right. Yeah. So let's dive into that, man. I know that you are a believer in scent lock. Not just a believer. It's worked for you for years. And you kind of use that technology the way it's supposed to be used, and and it's helped you kill a multitude of deer, and allows you to kind of approach the wind much different than anyone else approaches it. So if you wouldn't mind, just give a rundown of what your scent regimen is, and how it allows you to not worry about the wind per se.
Well, first off, I have to clarify what you started with. Mm-hmm. I am a huge advocate of activated carbon.
Right.
And ScentLock just happens to own the U.S. patent on using activated carbon in hunting clothing. So that's why I am a ScentLock freak. If somebody else owned the patent, it'd be whoever that would be. Because I've known about activated carbon for years, and I know how absorptive it is. It's the most absorptive substance known to man, and it's used in literally thousands of applications worldwide. It's in chemical warfare suits. It's in your water softeners. It's in all sorts of things. I mean, that it works as designed can't be argued, basically.
Right.
But I bought a ScentLock suit in the mid-'90s. In about 1999, I finally got to the point where I learned how to properly care for it, because they don't give you the proper instructions, in my opinion, even though they make it. Mm-hmm. And I learned how to properly deabsorb it. Mm-hmm. It's not reactivation. You can't reactivate it. You got to deabsorb it, because reactivating it means putting it at 1,450 degrees Fahrenheit under pressure, which obviously you can't do.
Right.
So you deabsorb it in the dryer and then throw it in an airtight container so it's not absorbing odors, because it's absorbing all the time. It can't differentiate whether you're hunting or whatever. Right. It's always absorbing. So by the 1998, I was doing testing as far as with deer during the October lull, when I wasn't too concerned about getting any opportunities at mature bucks. So I was kind of testing my scent regimen on does, and I got to the point where I pay absolutely no attention to wind direction whatsoever. It's totally 100% irrelevant. The only time wind direction plays any part in my hunting is if I'm setting up a location at a primary scrape area. If I'm setting up a location at a primary scrape area, which might be at an oak tree or might be at an apple tree, if there's an adequate tree on the southeast side of the location and it offers a good shot to the destination location, I will probably set that tree up, because it's not uncommon, and I've killed 2 monster bucks that came in and during the pre-rut and scent checked the scrapes from downwind. So I'll usually set off 15 to 20 yards off the actual scrapes. So I've got a 15 to 20 yard shot to the scrapes. And then if a buck comes in 30 yards downwind of the scrapes, in predominantly the wind's out of the northwest in the fall, so I'm on the southeast side. If he comes down, 30 yards downwind of the scrapes to scent check it, he doesn't actually come to the scrapes. I've still got a 20-yard shot to that animal. So on that situation, I will not only have a shooting lane to the actual scrapes, I'll have a shooting lane to the downwind side of it as well. So it has nothing to do with my scent control. I'm just setting it up that way because that's a possibility of a mature buck checking it from downwind and not actually coming into the actual scrape area. Right. But other than that, I pay zero attention to wind direction.
Right, and
I used to pay 100% attention to wind direction. There was places, when I had to pay attention to wind, there was places I quit hunting. I quit hunting sides of ridges. I quit hunting in saddles because of wind thermals and currents. There was, some of my best locations during the rut phases I couldn't hunt because the wind direction wasn't right during the days I had off work. So once you can get it so you don't have to pay attention to wind direction and you never get winded, your kill percentage goes up 50% right there.
Right. Yeah, beating a deer's nose. If you can do that consistently, man, it's I imagine that it makes a a world of difference. I mean, I know in reading some of your stuff, it's like you are completely kind of head to toe, right? It's gloves, it's head cover, it's
absolutely
the whole nine, right? Like
absolutely. And that I'm glad you said that, because the TV guys, even the guys that ScentLok sponsors, have no clue what they're doing with their ScentLok clothing. Mm-hmm. They wear a jacket and a pant, and they may wear gloves, and they got on some dumb logo hat with their hair hanging out, or they got a beard, or they got face paint. If you've got any of that stuff, you've just blown your scent regimen. You can't wear a jacket and a pant and say, okay, well, that's good enough, I'm done. No, it doesn't work that way. It's like driving a car with three wheels. You've got to do it all. You've got to cover, you've got to have a head cover on. When you're hunting, you don't have to wear it into your tree and up the tree, but once you get on stand, you got to put on a head cover with a drop-down face mask, where basically the only thing exposed is your eyes. If you have a beard, it's covering your beard, it's covering the hair in the back of your neck, because 40% of your odor comes out of your head.
Right.
So you got to have that, and you also have to do other things. You got to wear clean rubber boots. You've got to, if you wear a backpack, you got to wash your backpack now and then in non-scent detergent and store it in an airtight container. You know, lots of guys have had the same backpack for 5 years, and they reload it every day with their bare hands during season. You know, their garments, they're altering garments, and you know, every time you get done with a hunt, you reload it for the next hunt with their bare hands. So you can wear a ScentLok suit and have it 100% everything doing it correctly, and then you get winded and you blame it on the suit, when in reality you got a huge human scent wick in the tree with you in the form of your backpack that you haven't washed for 5 years.
Yeah.
And if anybody wants the ScentLok information, they can email me on that too. Just email me, I need scent control information. Nice. I'll send you a litany of information on it.
So you mentioned something like, so you mean to tell me that the face paint doesn't matter? I'm just kidding.
I can't believe people wear face paint. That just blows my mind. They try to look like an Indian. They try to look cool. The dumbest thing I've ever seen in my life.
I mean, it just lures the deer right in. I mean, it's like, hey, who wouldn't want to hang out with a cool guy with face paint on? You know, you gotta. I'm just kidding.
Wow. And beards. You know, I shave my armpits. I cut my hair as short as I can cut it during season. All that stuff is breeding ground for bacteria. Yeah. And bacteria is where you get your odor from. So, yeah, you've got to wear the head cover, activated carbon-lined head cover with the activated carbon-lined face mask. And obviously, when you get ready to take a shot, you just reach up with, if you're right-handed, you just reach up with your right hand and pull the face mask down under your chin so it doesn't impede your anchor point.
Right.
I mean, you don't shoot with the face mask up. You pull that down when you take your shot.
Right. Yeah, of course, because that'll mess with your anchor points and all that stuff that you're kind of been comfortable with over the year. So I want to jump into, I know, but when we did before we started recording, I had mentioned a good buddy of mine had a couple questions that he wanted to kind of toss out there and get your perspective. He's a big time public land hunter. He's, he's a super successful dude, at it, and I got a lot of respect for him, and he has a tremendous amount of respect for you. So I sent him a text and said, hey, I'm going to talk to John this evening, and said, hey, do you have any questions you want me to try to tee up if we have some time? And he tossed a few my way. So if you wouldn't mind to indulge us here, I'll kind of toss a few of these to you and see what your thoughts are. So
give it a shot.
Yeah. So the first one is he was kind of wondering, so when, how and why, you transition from your early season spots to pre-rut or rut spots. Is it sign related that makes you make that move from that transition from early to pre-rut or rut, or is it the time of year that's kind of dictating that? And specifically in an area that might be new to you, whether it's out of state or just a new property in general to you?
Well, if I'm in Michigan, it's just history has told me that hunting during the lull is almost a waste of time. I think of my 31 book bucks from Michigan. I think one of them was taken during the October lull. And I still hunt during the October lull occasionally, but they're not in my good rut phase locations. I leave those for the rut. But so basically, I hunt pretty hard the first 2, 3, possibly even 4 days, depending on the weather of season. And again, Michigan season opens October 1st. And then I just really slack off on my hunting. I just don't take hunting seriously at all until around the 25th of October. Mm-hmm. And then I'd go in and I'm hunting my rut phase locations that I haven't even been to since last April or March.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they are clean, and I'm not just, you know, and there's always other hunters on the property. I've never hunted a property by myself, so I've always got other hunters on the property. So, you know, I can't control what they do, but I know I've kept them clean, so I've done my part. And but then that's usually about October 25th is when I transition into pre-rut. And pre-rut's my favorite time done. When that's October 25th, probably November 5th, because the does haven't came into estrus yet, the majority, and the testosterone levels have risen in the bucks to the point where the mature bucks actually will get up and start searching for those early estrus does, because in a lot of areas where you got a lot of does, some does do come into estrus early. So they will get up and start searching for those, but it's usually during midday. It's usually between 11 o'clock and 3 o'clock. It's kind of an interesting stat of the 20 of the bucks I've shot during the rut phases in Michigan, which is a 2-week time frame prior to the gun season. 20 of the bucks from November 1st to November 14th, of the 20, 7 of them were taken between 11 and 3 o'clock in the afternoon. So while my time spent during midday was very minimal percentage-wise, my hours on stand during midday was very minimal compared to mornings and evenings, my kill rate was over 33%. It was about 35%.
Right.
So that midday thing is a big, big deal. And again, it's not just hunting midday. You got to be in the right types of locations. You got to have transition security cover from bedding area to where you're at. But they check their scrape areas, and they're very routine during pre-rut. Mature bucks, when they do that midday thing, they're checking their scrape areas. They're going to the oak trees that are dropping acorns still, or apple trees that are dropping apples, or whatever the food source may be, and they're staying in security cover, and they're checking their core area for possible early estrus does.
Now, would you say the higher percentage of those killed in that instance are you hunting scrapes, or were you hunting scrapes, or were you hunting more of those rut staging areas?
They were all at scrapes, and typically a rut staging area is a scrape area,
right? Yeah,
because there's heavy doe activity, and that's why they're staging there. They put their scrapes there because it's a heavy doe traffic area,
right? So
they're staging at their scrape areas.
All right, so this next one is kind of
but they weren't. But let me take that back a little bit.
Okay.
Because these bucks I shot in the midday, so they weren't staging. They were moving through these scrape areas during midday. But yes, they would be the same types of scrape areas that you would morning hunt as a staging, because they're going to come in and stage. Right. And on a morning hunt, if you're going to morning hunt at a staging area during the rut phases, you got to be in your tree at least an hour and a half before daylight.
Right.
Because they're going to come in and bed down and stage probably a half hour to 40 minutes before daylight. And you got to be there, and then hopefully get them after they get up and move later in the morning.
Right, and I know you like to get into the tree pretty early and beat the rooster to the tree pretty much. So.
Well, mature bucks move a lot. The mature bucks in pressured areas, they usually go in and bed down before daylight, and you got to be in there before they do that.
Right,
so,
and not just in there, but you need to be in there set up quiet, and ready for them to approach.
Quiet. Yeah, you need to be set up and quiet an hour and a half before daylight.
Yeah. So this next one is, we're going to assume you're hunting scrapes for this scenario, and it's the last week of October is the scenario. And the question really is, what's your game plan for where you plan to hunt in the instance that a scrape is going cold early? What are your thoughts on it's late October? You're usually planning to hunt over scrapes. The scrapes in the area you're planning to hunt have gone cold. Like, what are your thoughts as to why they've started to go cold? And let's assume we're not on a field edge or near a field edge, because I know you'd mentioned earlier that scrapes along field edges, once the food source kind of becomes null and void, that scrape's going to dry up. So let's kind of take a different approach.
That's an easy one. Scrape areas dry up because that's when when the majority of the does start coming into estrus. So this is usually early in November, not necessarily late October. When the majority of the does start coming into estrus, there's so few mature dominant bucks in pressured areas that they no longer have to go and work their scrapes. They're with does. They're doed up pretty much all the time. because as soon as they are with a doe or maybe two does and they go through their 28 to 36 hour estrus cycle, breed them every 20 minutes, half hour, whatever, once their estrus cycles are over, they don't have to typically go very far before they intercept the next hot doe. You know, that next hot doe may be with a 2.5-year-old 8-point, but that 3.5-year-old buck's going to take him away from her and try and corral her back into a secure bedding area and do the breeding during the rest of her cycle. Mm-hmm. So it's very, very common for scrapes to start getting dried up after once the majority of the does start entering their estrus cycles. That's extremely common.
Right. And I know you mentioned earlier that, scrapes are kind of dictated by does, right? That's what's happening.
Doe activity.
By doe activity, right. So, with that, if the scrapes are kind of if does who are coming in late are dictating that scrape activity, What do you mean coming in late?
So
they're coming in. So they're beginning to they're those who are coming in later into estrus, right? So it's the back half maybe, right, of that cycle. So if they're coming in late, and that's what's kind of creating the doe activity. But you could guess there's a bell curve with this stuff, right? So it's on the back end of the bell curve where you're not in the prime time where most of your does are going to be creating the activity. Are you still going to concentrate on those scrapes, or do you start to transition more to covering doe bedding area and some of those kind of like rut staging areas?
Typically during the rut, I am at a scrape area or I am in a bedding area.
Okay.
Because once the majority of scrape activity will actually start picking up again once the majority of does are bred. Because then the mature bucks actually have to go out and start searching again for late estrus does. It's exactly the same as pre-rut. It's just past rut as opposed to pre-rut.
Right.
So now those bucks have to actually go out and start searching for does, and it takes them time because there's not that many does in estrus at that time. So they go back to following the same, scrape area routes that they were doing during pre-rut, that they had abandoned during the peak rut when they were with does most of the time. So yeah, those same scrape areas are in fact that 180 incher I shot on that freelance hunt was at a scrape area during post rut. It was the rut was actually the majority of the does in the area were already bred. It was, I think, November 27th or something like that. And that was an out of state hunt, and that buck was definitely without question searching, his old scrape areas and working them. The scrapes where I was at, where I set up, were very, very active. And it was kind of weird because when I shot him, his eyes were drawn. I mean, he had been breeding and he'd lost all of his weight. When I skinned him, his meat was purple and he'd lost all his weight. His eyes were sunk into his head. I mean, he was just wore out. And he still was out looking for more does, those late estrus does. So bedding areas, post-rut is always within bedding areas, and at scrape areas where there has to be a lot of security cover, especially if I'm in a state like Michigan, because if you're talking like after gun season, man, your odds of getting this was in Iowa where I killed that 180 incher.
Right.
If you're talking in Michigan, once opening day of gun season and you put 700,000 gun hunters out in the woods, your odds of killing something during post rut's pretty slim. I think I've killed two bucks in Michigan in almost 50 years with my bow in December. So that's a real skinny. Now my preference when I go out of state is to hunt post rut.
Huh.
Because exactly what I said. Thanksgiving from about the 22nd of November until the 1st of December. So basically when you are going to do that, you're limited to about 2 or 3 states. You're limited to Ohio, Iowa, and Kansas.
Right.
Because they have very late gun seasons where you can still hunt that Thanksgiving time frame prior to the opener of their gun season. And the reason being is the mature bucks are just drawn down, they're wore out. I think they've lost a lot of their security cover precautions, and they're just moving and they're just looking for those late estrus does. and they seem to throw caution to the wind. They just move differently. They're just worn out, but they've still got the drive to breed.
Right. They still got
So
that.
they're going back to their preseason routine of checking scrape areas and skirting the edges of bedding areas, and but they just seem to have thrown caution more to the wind, so they're a little less on edge.
That's interesting, because I've always kind of contemplated heading out to Ohio, because I always go. I spend some time during the rut in Ohio, and I've always contemplated going out during that Thanksgiving time frame. And now you've kind of intrigued me. Now I might have to if I don't tag out this earlier part of November, I might have to make a secondary trip out there and put some time in after Thanksgiving. So
2 years ago, I got invited to hunt this guy's property in southern Ohio, and him and his buddy had gun hunted it and bow hunted it. They shot at this big 10-point 2 different times during gun season, and they didn't kill him, and I killed him on my second evening bow hunt, and it was 150-inch 10-point. And that was in, I think, December 15th.
That's awesome.
And he was checking scrapes.
Nice. So speaking of a story, I always like to kind of conclude things before we wrap this thing up with a quick story. So if you wouldn't mind, share a little story with us. Anything from a successful hunt or a near miss, or just something that's memorable to you, and give us every detail of the state that you were hunting, and everything from the time you hopped out of the truck back to the tailgate.
Well, let me see. I like freelance. The freelance hunts are kind of cool.
Yeah.
But that Ohio hunt was really, you know what? I'm going to give you an Illinois hunt, public land in December. This one was really good too, because this one here will give your listeners something to think about and something to maybe key on personally themselves for hunting in the late season. I wanted to go hunting in Illinois. I'd never hunted in Illinois before, and I was going to go to Starved Rock State Park. That's a big, huge piece of public land, and I think Matheson Parks borders it. So there's 2 big state parks. It's like 16,000 acres. And I was going by myself, but I wanted to go after a snow, because I knew if I went after a snow, I'd be looking at immediate sign that was made within the last 24 hours. Mm-hmm. So I watched the weather, and when it looked like there was going to be some snow going through, I called the park ranger, because all the parks in Illinois have park rangers, because they actually have buildings with park rangers in them. And I said, "Did you guys get that snow that was going through? I'm thinking of coming down there bow hunting." And this is after their gun season. This was just several days after their last gun season. And he said, "Yeah, we got 8 inches of fresh snow." So I had my van all loaded up, and I just took off and went down there, and it was kind of interesting. You had to park. You had to go to this specific building, and you had to pull a card off of there was 32 slots. Each one had a clipboard, and each one had X amount of parking passes on the clipboard. So each slot designated a different parking area in this park. And the park I was hunting in, you only had 2 passes, so only 2 people could hunt and park in this spot and hunt. So I signed into this spot, and I went in and I scouted. And again, I wasn't hunting; I was just totally scouting. And I found 2 different locations where there was locust trees. Now, locust trees are those trees that have those big, long spiked needles on them in clusters, and they were just tore up underneath. I mean, the acorns had pretty much been mowed up, and there was a big, huge weed field. I'm talking 10-foot tall weeds butting up to this wooded area, and like 15 yards off the side of these weeds was this one locust tree, and it was just like a plow went in there. I mean, there was beans laying all over the top of the snow, and it had just been churned up. So I set up in a tree about 15 yards away from it, and the very first evening I was hunting it, it was 7 degrees when I left the hotel, 35-mile-an-hour straight winds. I mean, it was cold.
Yeah. And
I had on 2 Rivers West ambush jackets, 5 adhesive body warmers, and I got up in the tree, and about a half hour before dark, I was like why are you sitting here? It's snowing like crazy. I mean, it is snowing hard, and it's just vertical because it's so windy. And I almost got out of the tree because I hadn't seen anything. I kept my nose, because I was in a saddle, so I'm facing the tree. I kept my nose right up tight to the tree so it wasn't making my eyes water. It was that windy.
Right.
And about a half hour before dark, I'm like, you know what? You might as well just get out of the tree and go back to the motel. Nothing's gonna move. And I'm like, you know what? You only got a half hour left. Just sit here and take it. You're not cold. You got all these body warmers on. You're fine. So I sat there, and about 10 minutes later, I looked down. I could see out of the right side of the tree, which was the other side from where the locust tree was. I saw 3 little bucks. There was a spike horn, a 4-point, and a 6-point. And they walked out of the timber and walked right into that weed field. I was like, well, that's kind of weird. I expected deer to come out of the weed field to the locust tree.
Right.
And so anyway, just before dark, I had a small 10-point come in and come out of the weed field and started eating locust beans. And basically those locust beans, they don't touch them during the fall, when it's just grass out. But during the winter, they're major feeding sources. And he would just kick his paw one time, and like 5 bean pods would pop up off the ground, and they'd just chew them, have them sticking out of his mouth 10 inches. And he was about 110-inch or 2.5-year-old, and I didn't shoot him. And just before dark, still snowing like crazy, I saw 3 does coming down the edge of the weeds and a big buck behind them. And they moved in, and it was a 12-point. Just a perfectly typical 12-point. And I shot him, and he ran about 80 yards and tipped over, and it was just an absolute awesome hunt. And then the next year I went and shot a 9-point, same exact tree, same exact scenario, called the park ranger, made sure they had snow. Yeah. And I don't know why I haven't went back yet.
Yeah. Sounds like a place you should be visiting more often.
But the takeaway from that story is a lot of guys go on big parcels of public land in November or whatever. But if you go to these big parcels of public land and there's deer left after gun season, go after you've got a fresh snow. That way, when you're walking around, you're not looking at runways that could be 3 weeks old. You're looking at sign that was made in the last 24 hours. So that's all sign that's being used right now.
Right.
And, key on that. There was a friend of mine that hunted this other public land in farther south in Ohio, and he hunted it for several years and never shot anything. And he's like, well, man, they killed every time I'm down there, somebody on this 16,000 acres kills a 170-incher and a couple 160s. Well, how many people are there? I don't know, a couple hundred. I'm like, well, look at the odds.
Right.
If you get 2 monster bucks and there's a couple hundred people, that's a 1% odds.
Right.
So that's pretty crappy. So I told him about the snow thing. And the very first year he went down there, he went in December because he'd been going in November, and he shot a buck the very first year. And I haven't talked to that guy since then. But he shot a buck the first afternoon of the very first time he went there in December.
That's awesome. Yeah. So I might need to try the old snow bit. I got a pretty nice spot picked out in Ohio that I've seemed to like. It's one of those places that I have a couple years of intel on it now, and I killed a nice buck there. The first year I was there, actually, the 3rd day I hunted it. And I didn't even know it was called the Eberhart approach, to be honest with you, but that's the approach I took. I walked in, I scouted it on my way in. I found good sign. I hung a stand, and I saw bucks every day, and a handful of shooters, and I finally got a shot at one the 3rd day, and I was there for 8 days and was tagged out after 3. So
that's awesome. Isn't that a good feeling?
Oh, it was by far one of my favorite hunts. I mean, the deer was awesome, that I was able to harvest, but it was just one of those things where I went in and didn't know a whole lot about the spot other than what I'd basically seen on some aerial. I did a speed scout in the summer, but didn't even really hit that spot. I kind of was all around it, and I just happened to. I was like, what, this is where I'm going to go in. I kind of looked at it on a map, and I was like, I kind of like what this, how the terrain's laying out, and hopped up in a tree. And it was just, it was as you're talking, during this, hour and a half we've been chatting, I'm kind of thinking back to that spot as you're kind of mentioning things. And it has almost every element that you had mentioned. There was a primary scrape that was there, and just, it was almost, picturesque, where there was a primary scrape and there was a vine that was hanging down over the primary scrape that was natural, that was there as a licking branch. And It was, a huge scrape area. There was all kinds of transition to bedding cover on the back side of that ridge, and then right below on the opposite side of the ridge there was additional transition cover that was there, that where if a deer was walking through there, they only had to take about 2 bounds and they were disappearing in any direction. And man, it was nonstop every day. I would have deer come in at daybreak. They would spend some time with me. Bucks would come in snorting, ready to fight, ready to spar, ripping up trees. And it was unreal. So last year, wouldn't you know, I didn't go back there.
Because?
I was looking for that challenge and that Big Woods challenge, but I'll be going back this year. Let's just say that.
Yeah, I'm thinking of going back to that Illinois spot. That was in 2008.
Yeah. You need to make that rotation. But hey, before I let you go, I know I've kept you for a little while, and I do appreciate you spending some time with me, man. I'd like for you to just give some folks out there, information on where they can find out more about you. I know you got some workshops and stuff going on, so just where they can find out more about you, where they can find your books, and how they can get involved in the any of the workshops you got going on.
The workshops I only do in March, April, and early May. I just don't feel I'm doing the attendees justice if I do them in the summer when there's foliage everywhere, because you can't see why. You can't see the reasons why I do things when there's foliage. Right. But my website is DEER hyphen the little line JOHN.net. So it's deer-john.net, and my books, you can buy my books on there as well, and I've got most of my the URLs for all the podcasts that I've done, and yours will be on there too, I hope. And there's a lot of information on there about what I do in the books and the DVDs, and my email, if anybody wants me to send me anything on harness, saddle hunting, or on scent control, I'll be more than happy to forward you the information, is Deer John. So this is my email, DEERJOHN 51, the number 51, at gmail.com. So it's deerjohn51 at gmail.com.
Awesome, man. So all you folks out there, be sure to get a hold of John. I've read through the documents that you sent me, and they're quite possibly some of the most, I work in like a medical-ish field, and I think you had a more thorough document on your scent control than most of like the medical studies that I read. So it was...
I don't believe anything any hunting manufacturer prints on their website.
Right.
Even Scentlocks. I research everything, because nothing in the hunting industry was created by the hunting industry. If there's a technology, it came from someplace else. Hunting companies don't have R&Ds. They don't have staff scientists. It came from the auto industry or a governmental body or some sort of a big business pharmaceutical company. It did not come from our little minuscule hunting industry. So right. I don't believe anything any hunting company prints on their website. I research the technology and see where it's used and how it's used and how effective it is in other industries.
And that, sir, is why you have a wall of giant bucks. So thanks so much for coming on, buddy.
Thank you, Clint.
John Eberhart, everybody. Thanks, man.
Thank you. Good luck, everybody, this fall. All
right, folks, that is a wrap for today's show. I'd like to thank John for joining. Be sure to visit his website at eberhartwhitetailworkshop.com to check out his upcoming workshop dates or purchase his books and DVDs. I'll place all the links in the blog post show notes as well. We'd of course like to thank all of you for listening, and if you haven't, please head over to iTunes and leave us a 5-star rating, and be sure to subscribe to the podcast to make sure it's delivered directly to your device each and every week. We'd be super appreciative if you'd take some time to do those two things. And before we shut this thing down, we need to give a big shout out to our partners that continue to help us make this podcast possible. Wicked Tree Gear, Exodus Outdoor Gear, Trophy Ridge, Ozonics, Obsession Bows, Tecumani Seed, Glacier Coolers, Ramcat Broadheads, and Trophy Taker Rests. And until next time, we'll see y'all.